Hello everybody on YouTube, it's me, Master Maker here again, and it's been a while since I actually did a touch-up on some Thomas and Friends topics, and man oh man have I got some to talk about. Today is probably going to be the most pivotal one. I'll be talking about, in retrospect, the day Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends died, or how it how it went from this to this. But okay, I'll go ahead and start off. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, or the Railway series, started off as a series of books called the Railway series. It was the brainchild of Reverend W. Audrey. When writing these stories, Audrey had to write for two audiences. He wrote for the unfortunate parents who had to read the book to their children, and he put in little funny bits that he knew they would like. And then, of course, he was writing for the children, which liked the idea of talking trains with faces. But when he first wrote the books had just been written solely to entertain his sick child who was confined to the bed with measles, Chris Audrey. The first story he wrote was one about Edward, when he got to come out of the shed for the first time and pull coaches. Over time, Reverend Audrey's wife would persuade him to have these books published. The second book he published would be called Thomas the Tank Engine, based off of the main character of the show. But in the books, Thomas wasn't the main character. The Railway series featured an ensemble cast of many characters. Now let's move on to the show. In 1953, the BBC attempted to make their own take on Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, or the Railway series as it was then called, but they ultimately failed. After that, Audrey was hesitant on ever again doing a television adaptation of the Railway series. He was approached in 1976 by someone by the name of Andrew Lloyd Webber of his own company. However, ultimately, nothing happened. And he was approached again in the late 70s by Brittany Allcroft, or just Britt Allcroft, of the Allcroft Filming Company. She was doing a documentary on railways and instantly fell in love with the books, the Railway series, and asked Audrey if he wanted to do a television adaptation of Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends, or the Railway series. Audrey was still hesitant at first, but in 1983, Britt Allcroft signed a deal with David Mitton of Clearwater Studios, the same studio behind Thunderbirds and Tugs, I think, and ultimately, they would make the pilot. The pilot was successful, and the first season was greenlit the following year. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends was off to a good start. They took a 5-year break after 1986 with the success of Season 2, and ultimately, they decided to do other stuff in that time. During that time, Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends reached the United States of America, and everybody loved Thomas. In fact, it was so successful they passed it off to places like Spain and Japan, even. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends was looking at its all-time high. But Reverend Audrey started hating the show for doing things that didn't seem train-like in any way, or realistic. He hated the episode Henry's Forest. And he, pretty much hated Season 3 in general. Which I've got my own issues with Season 3, but that'll have to wait until another video. Thomas the Tank Engine was at an all-time high. Many people say that after the 5th season, which is the roaring success of the model series, that's when the series died. However, if I had to pick a time the series died, well, was on its deathbed but didn't quite completely die, it would be with the release of the 2000 movie Thomas and the Magic Railroad. Personally, I have a lot of love for this movie. I think that this Thomas movie, by far, is cinema, sort of. I mean, there are other Thomas movies. Great discovery. But, yes, this Thomas movie was the first one, and it featured the elements of the show Thomas had come to the U.S. through, called Shining Time Station, thus alienating the UK audiences. Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends' general reputation was kind of messed up. The first 5 seasons built upon real-life incidents that happened, things that happened in real life, things that made sense. But Thomas and the Magic Railroad just made Thomas seem like a marketing tool from then on. Nothing special. No purpose to teach morals or anything. After Thomas and the Magic Railroad bombed, Britt Allcroft ended up resigning her company following the film's release. Season 6 was greenlit in 2002 and released that same year. Even though Seasons 6 and 7 weren't quite as successful, they still had some juice left in the cup, so to speak. However, all that juice in the cup would eventually vanish. In 2002, late 2002, please note, late 2002, Hit Entertainment finalized their purchase of Ghoulane Entertainment, the then current owner of the Thomas brand, that was now just making Thomas and Friends a marketing tool completely. But it still had juice left in the tank, or cup, whatever. That doesn't mean that it wasn't free from people who were looking simply to capitalize upon the success of the series, which they did. Hit Entertainment greenlit seasons 8 through 12 in 2004 all the way through 2008. However, those seasons had plenty of issues. Everything was jammed down to children. The morals ended up being stated, something that Reverend Audrey definitely would have hated. And not only that, they even got some of the characters wrong. Even Edward, the first character of the series. In 2007, Thomas and Friends: The Great Discovery would release, or 2008, sorry. And that felt like a perfect finale for the series. However, Hit Entertainment felt the need to simply take all that good stuff, and just stretch it out needlessly into season 12, where the first downfall began. Seasons 12 all the way through 16 were a disaster of their own, but in 2012, Mattel would purchase Hit Entertainment, and under their leadership, some pretty good changes would be seen. The Brenner era of Thomas and Friends had begun. The Brenner era was the second best era of Thomas and Friends. The Renaissance. During that time, Andrew Brenner and other writers like Lee Pressman, Davey Moore, Helen Farrell, Laura Beaumont, and Paul Larson would take over, and they would do things the fans actually liked. All of this was a pretty good contributor to a rebirth of Thomas and Friends. However, Mattel was starting to see a more better interest in the franchise. By better, I do mean worse. So if I had to pick a day Thomas and Friends truly died for good, it would be with the 2018 movie, Thomas and Friends: Big World, Big Adventures. More like Big Disaster, Big Marketing Scheme. Big World, Big Adventures was the first big downfall, as it broke the laws of the universe. Thomas did things a train shouldn't have done. He did stuff like Tai Chi, turned into the Eiffel Tower, an airplane, a helicopter, an elephant, for crying out loud. Oh gosh. After that, seasons 22 through 24 took quite a downward spiral and really took things in a direction the fans hated. There were still some little good episodes sprinkled all throughout, and then we received the finale to the whole series, Thomas and the Royal Engine. I watched it myself, and all things considered, I think it was the last decent bit of the series that there was. Personally, I would have stopped at the Great Discovery, but you get the idea. The following year, Mattel greenlit a reboot of Thomas and Friends completely. This reboot was called Thomas and Friends All Engines Go, and it completely dumbed things down. Thomas did things a train shouldn't have done, with an awful voice cast, cheap animation, and terrible writing. A disgrace to Reverend Audrey's legacy, as the fans put it. While Britt Allcroft and David Mitten were still in charge, things still looked pretty good. Thomas and Friends looked like it was taking a turn for the better. But Thomas the Tank Engine and Friends can't survive without Reverend Audrey or people like Andrew Brenner, Michael White, or Britt Allcroft. Because I think when they left, that was because their creative interest in the show had gone. And that was the day Thomas and Friends died.
Always make sure to remember that little engines can indeed do big things, and no matter how little or big you are, you always have an opportunity to like, share, and subscribe on these videos. And don't forget to ding your notification button so you won't miss any daily uploads. Catch us next time. Goodbye!